Good evening. This is Justin Ford in the studio for Africa Christian Action Salt and Light on Radio Tygerberg. Tonight we're going to provide an overview of the human trafficking pandemic. In the studio with me is Tershia de Klerk, the founder and MD of the Joseph Movement NPC, non-profit company.
Yes.
Welcome, Tershia. Can you please begin by defining for the audience what exactly is human trafficking?
Thank you, Justin. Yes, so something that's very important for all of us to realize is that human trafficking is, at the end of the day, exploitation of people's vulnerabilities. It's essentially a form of modern-day slavery. And I've had a number of people who have asked me, is XYZ a form of trafficking? Is this situation a form of trafficking? And so forth. And so I just want to provide people a very easy description of how one can identify a situation as possible human trafficking. So a very easy way to identify a situation as a human trafficking situation is as follows. So human trafficking takes place when a person is either tricked, forced, or coerced into a situation for the use of their body or for their labor. So if you can memorize that, it's a very easy way of then identifying a human trafficking situation. So let me just repeat it. So human trafficking takes place when a person is either tricked, forced, or coerced into a situation for the use of their body or for their labor. And what's very interesting in South Africa and in many other countries is that according to our South African legislation, transportation is not a prerequisite for human trafficking to take place. So that's also something that's very important for us to remember. And later on, we'll most probably touch on some other situations and forms of human trafficking, so people will understand why we say that. So many people see human trafficking as, for instance, a child that goes missing or people that are shipped in containers across borders. But that is, in essence, a situation where transportation took place. So those are forms of human trafficking, but there are also other forms of human trafficking where transportation does not take place. So very important matter and fact to remember.
Yeah, that leads to the next question. What are the different types of human trafficking then?
Yes, so we all are used to or hear the terms sex trafficking, labor trafficking quite frequently. Those are the most common forms of human trafficking that we hear about. But then there are also other phases of human trafficking, such as domestic servitude. So domestic servitude is something that's very rampant in South Africa specifically. So it would be someone who comes across as some form of domestic servant, maybe a cleaner. It can even be a gardener or someone who serves in a B&B. But they are held perhaps against their will or in harsh circumstances. They don't have the freedom to move or to go back home, for instance. And some of them hardly get paid or they don't get paid at all. Then we also have forced marriage. We have forced begging. And I just want to go back to forced marriage. So also a form of human trafficking that's quite rampant in South Africa. There is a practice called ukutwala, which is actually a traditional and quite a beautiful Xhosa practice, but it has been distorted throughout the years. So what is happening now is that little girls are forcefully being taken away from their families and then handed to older men for sexual pleasure. And then, of course, I mentioned the forced begging. We do know that so many people on the streets are there because of their own will, but we also know that there are quite a number of human trafficking rings that actually force, especially the most vulnerable, mostly children, to go onto the streets and beg. And then we've got organ harvesting and baby harvesting. In many cases, that is used for medical purposes and even beauty products and health products, muti. Then we've got child soldiers. We also have forced illegal activities, such as illegal minors. We also recently received confirmation of something that's becoming very much a popular and growing phenomenon, which is forced online scamming. So we're very aware of, there's online scams that take place. And I mean, this has been going on for many years. But now we actually have evidence and proof of quite a number of cases where scamming situations take place under the guidance of traffickers. There's also snuff movies. I don't know if you know what snuff movies is, Justin.
I think that's a film where people are, where someone is killed on screen.
Yes. Yeah. So it would be torture and murder on screen or being recorded, and then it goes onto the dark web. And then also bachabazi, which is really boy play. And that's something that comes from the East. And it is a situation in which mostly adolescent boys are used for entertaining older men and also for their sexual gratification. So as you can see, there are so many different faces of human trafficking, and it's important for us to be aware of these because the biggest percentage of human trafficking that takes place actually takes place all around us, and right under our noses. I mean, you can walk into a shop, for instance, and not necessarily know that the person you're speaking to, who's in many cases a foreigner, is actually there because he's been either tricked or forced into that situation. When we look at, for instance, forced begging, I mean, many of us, it's an uncomfortable situation when you're approached by a beggar, but so many of them are there because they are being forced by traffickers, to collect money or to collect food. And if they don't come back with anything, or if they come back empty-handed, then they get punished. So all these faces are very, very important for us to remember. And it helps us to understand, or let me rather say, it's a starting point when it comes to training people and helping people understand how they can identify possible human trafficking victims.
Can you give us any reliable statistics on human trafficking globally, or perhaps specifically South Africa?
Yes, most definitely. Well, when you say reliable, dare I say, that's our sources are our National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is the South African Human Trafficking Hotline. And I'll share that information a bit later on, which is just so important to have on hand. And then we also get our stats from the Global Slavery Index as well as the United Nations. So you'll notice that I haven't mentioned any specific government. We don't rely on government stats, but those are the statistics. More specifically, the Global Slavery Index and our National Human Trafficking Hotline that we rely on. And when we look at those statistics, we see that there's almost 50 million people that are living in modern-day slavery today. We do believe that it's more. It was just under 50 million in 2021. And what we've seen is just over 27 million were in forced labor. And wait for this one. 22 million in forced marriage. So those are massive numbers. Forced marriage doesn't, of course, just happen in South Africa. It does happen globally. And we also see that just over 5 people out of every 1,000 in the world globally fall victim to human trafficking. And when we refer back to the hotline, which is managed by A21, which is like one of the front runners of organizations that combat human trafficking, some of their latest statistics is extremely interesting. So the various ways in which survivors were trafficked globally are as follows. So number one, the most popular way in which victims were trafficked is through false job offers. That's number one. Secondly, sold by family. And we see that time and time again, that most of the perpetrators are either family members or friends of family. Then number three is a lover boy. So by lover boy, we're meaning, it links to grooming. And then fourth is trafficked by a friend. And then only fifth on the list is abduction. So that's why I also mentioned to you earlier, it is so important that we understand that human trafficking is not reliant on transportation. So it's very, very important for us to know that. So that I just found that those statistics are so interesting that abduction is fifth on the list, Oh, yeah. And then when we look at South Africa, you were asking about South Africa, we see that from what we know, approximately 160,000 people are victims and trapped in a human trafficking situation at any given time in South Africa.
161,000.
160,000 approximately. Yeah. And what is also interesting stat that hardly ever shifts is when it comes to those who manage to escape or be rescued out of a human trafficking situation, and that's only up to 2%.
2%.
Which is an extremely scary figure. So because of that fact, the Joseph movement and a number of other organizations really strongly believe and work in reducing human trafficking by preventative education. So prevention is absolute key, You know that popular say, prevention is better than cure. And then just lastly, which is a statistic that I find very interesting, when it comes to persons who have been convicted of human trafficking, the latest statistic that we received from the UN's GLOTIP report is that 62% are male and 38% are female. So those are convicted traffickers. So 38% are female. And I just want to emphasize that because one always often tend to, point fingers at the men. But when we look at these statistics, and specifically when we looked at, sex trafficking, what we've seen in South Africa specifically with sex rings or prostitution rings, the most successful sex rings have a female right at the top running the whole show. So that's also a very interesting statistic and fact to remember.
Can you just repeat that percentage of the perpetrators?
Yeah, sure. So males are 62%.
62%.
And females 38%. Of persons who have been convicted of human trafficking globally.
Yeah, and you mentioned this organization called A21. Why is it called A21? Do you know?
I actually don't. That's actually a very good question.
Okay.
I have no idea. There must be a very good reason for that.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the 21 referred to some statistic or...
Yeah. But people are very welcome. Just go look up A21. They are an amazing organization, a global organization, and we work very closely with them as well here in South Africa.
Is human trafficking a bit of a euphemism or a misnomer? Is slavery a more appropriate term, do you think?
Yes, that's. I love that question. Yeah. But that's why I said, human trafficking is actually it's just modern day slavery, definitely.
Yeah.
And you hit the nail on the head, because it is actually, the term is very misleading, human trafficking, because you expect movement. In South Africa and some other countries, many other countries, it's not a prerequisite.
Yeah.
So yes, human trafficking is actually, the term itself is definitely misleading. Yeah.
And is it once someone is a victim of human trafficking, is that a life sentence, or? I mean, can they escape? I mean, he said 2% escape. So I mean, for the rest, is that the end of the story for them?
Well, I don't want to say yes, but it is something that, it is a crime that's very hidden. And the problem is that so much of it is either concealed or covered up by other crimes, such as maybe prostitution or the drug trade. And that's why it's so important for us, many of us NGOs, because a lot of NGOs are really standing in the gap for our government and so forth when it comes to combating human trafficking. But it's so important for us to educate people in how to identify victims of human trafficking. That's why we would do these kind of talks, to tell people that these are the different faces of human trafficking. It's not just abduction. There's so much more. It's so much more complex. So when we look at slavery of many years ago, it was out in the open and it was accepted, socially accepted. Now it's hidden, and it's definitely not socially accepted, but it's hidden because of some of the factors that we've just mentioned. And also people are held captive by fear, because their lives are threatened, the lives of their loved ones. We have foreigners that come into our country. So many of them are coming into our country, as we've seen with that A21 stat. The number one way in which they were lured was through job offers, and it was fake job offers. They come into our country, and then the identification documents are taken, they're being threatened, and they're being forced into either sex slavery or forced labor or any other of those faces that we spoke about.
Okay. What is particularly stood out for you, Tershia, when it comes to the child trafficking?
Yes, so what we're seeing is that the ages are actually becoming increasingly younger when it comes to the exploitation of children. And also in South Africa, we're seeing that the number of boys that are being exploited are increasing, and those stats are busy catching up with the number of girls. So what I'm saying is there's just this natural tendency with all of us to want to protect little girls even more than boys. But the reality is that we are seeing that the exploitation of boys is increasing and catching up with the girls. So parents really need to keep this in mind and protect our boys as well. And then predators are increasing online, and we've seen a massive jump during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. And I mean, why not? Because why should you work harder if you can work smarter? And that is exactly what they're doing. They are using the internet, they're using apps, social media and so forth to find their victims. If it's not finding their victims through geolocations, it would be grooming victims. So online activity is something that we should all be very careful of, and parents should really educate their children on safety precautions and what they can do if they feel uncomfortable in any conversation, perhaps with someone and so forth, and just be open. I always say to parents, if your child is on it, you should be too, because it's we have to educate ourselves, although for many of us it's perhaps not, we're not really interested. But if you have children and they are on apps and so forth, it's good for you to be on it as well, so that you can get to know the insides and outs of this app, and just, you don't have to feel uncomfortable in maybe intruding in your child's how can I say, in their personal activity, but you can show them interest. Show them that you're interested in these apps, and ask them questions about the apps and so forth, so that they become more comfortable in talking to you about it. And through that, you'll get to know the apps better, and you can also, through those conversations, just guide your children in giving them some good advice and tips as to how they can stay safe. And through that process, I believe that one can also, gain your child's trust, in the sense that they would feel that you are more approachable if they maybe come across anything that is questionable.
Yeah, that sounds like a whole program on its own, child trafficking.
Yes, most definitely. We must do that.
Yeah, we've already touched on it, but can you just elaborate again why it is that human trafficking is such a hidden crime?
Yes. So we did touch on it, yes. So besides it being overshadowed by other crimes, we also see that victims don't often ask for help because of the fear factor. And some, specifically foreigners, cannot find help in a language that they really understand properly. And we also see that many victims are so traumatized, especially within the sex industry, and especially if it's children, in any other form of trafficking, they are so traumatized that they cannot see themselves as the victims. So psychologically, that plays quite a big role. And then some victims resort to accepting perks from their traffickers and become traffickers themselves. And this is something that's also quite interesting. When we look, for instance, to the sex industry or sex trafficking, we've seen that those people, and I say people, not ladies or women, because it is not only women that are within the prostitution system, there are also children and there are men, but they especially accept perks and become traffickers themselves, because that then relieves them of much of the abuse. But once again, that is also where fear plays quite a big role. So these are some of the top factors that play quite a big role in concealing human trafficking.
Yeah, and for today we have one more question. What are contributing factors leading to human trafficking and modern day slavery?
Okay, so should we look at just South Africa?
Yeah.
Well, we've got, as we all know, high unemployment. That definitely leads to that for for obvious reasons. If the top way in which traffickers are luring people is fake job offers, then you can put 2 and 2 together. So high unemployment, and then of course weak and corrupt border control, which we don't have to go into detail. Another factor in South Africa is muti. That also leads to that when it comes to baby harvesting and organ harvesting, unfortunately. Then also cultural practices, for example, ukutwala, the forced marriage that I mentioned earlier. And then another factor which is very rampant in South Africa, especially in our informal settlements, is absent parents and child-led households, which is a very sad situation. And in some cases, it's not that the parents are absent on purpose. In many cases, yes. Some cases, they're not absent on purpose. They are trying to make a living and bring money into the home. But that makes children a lot more vulnerable, of course. Yeah. Then technology. We know pornography is so easy to get your hands on now that you don't have to walk to a video shop, for instance, and take anything out. Now it's just by a few clicks on your computer. So technology, pornography and prostitution. So those are definitely factors that feed human trafficking. Without human trafficking, should I add, pornography and prostitution will completely fall on its head. Because we have seen time and time again that so many people who are within the prostitution system are victims of human trafficking, and then many actors and actresses are also victims of human trafficking when it comes to pornography. Mm-hmm. So that is something that we need to always keep in mind. With pornography, there's always two victims. It's the consumer, because you can become addicted to it. Yeah. And then it is the one on the screen. Yeah. You do not know necessarily the age of that person, first of all. If that person is under 18, it is considered child abuse, even if it's with consent. And you also don't know under what circumstances that person is acting out. So always something important to remember. And so consumers and sex buyers really fuel the demand. And unfortunately, where there is a demand, there always will be a supply. So the demand needs to decrease. So the more people who are consuming pornography, the more the demand will increase and the more human trafficking will increase.
Yeah, Tershia, thank you very much for that introduction, which we'll continue in the next episode. But in closing, can you just give us any resources that you'd like to point the audience to?
Yes, most definitely. So I just want to encourage everyone to follow the Joseph Movement. Just Google Joseph Movement, and then you would find us then on many social media platforms, and we do try and share a lot of information there. And then also our website, which is josephmovement.org.za. And please remember, there is a National Human Trafficking Hotline number, which is 0800 222 777, where you can report possible human trafficking activity.
Thank you very much, Tershia. In closing, I'd like to read Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Please join us next week at the same time, 104 FM on Radio Tygerberg, for the next program of Salt and Light. God bless and good night.